as France is continuing to regain its lost influence, most especially on the African continent, in its former colonies, mostly in West Africa. More problems are piling up on the nation. President Emmanuel Macron is grappling to ensure him and his party regain lost love from the French, who are now frustrated with the way the government is tackling the issue of immense debts putting the nation at stake. His cabinet's decisions have not only led to massive protests, but also giving out signals to the world to the extent that one of the former giants is sinking to the bottom with little hope of coming back. France's national debt is a serious and worsening issue, reaching 113% of its GDP and projected to hit 116% by the end of 2025. This level of debt, exacerbated by past budget deficits and insufficient tax revenue to fund its social programs, is raising market concerns and increasing borrowing costs. The debt crisis is intertwined with political instability, as a lack of legislative majority hinders the government's ability to enact necessary fiscal reforms, posing risks to the country's sovereignty and the wider Eurozone economy. For more than 60 years, France sustained neo-colonial dominance over its former African colonies in the form of policies collectively known as Francafrique. The rise and fall of Francafrique is a story of hubris, greed and neglect that today correlates globally as the geopolitical result of French failure in Africa's surface. A number of France's former colonies have experienced military coups in recent years, notably 2 within 1 year in Mali, August 2020 and May 2021, in Burkina Faso in 2022, and Niger in 2023. All the new leaders in these countries were saying the same thing: France out. The remaining nations that didn't come out directly to expel French troops out of their countries, like Senegal, Ivory Coast, were also planning for a fair withdrawal of the French troops, hence showing signs that the French influence in the Western region was reaching an epitome of ending.
It was assimilation. They came to the colonies and they wanted to convert you into Frenchmen and French women. And in school parades in the colonized parts of the world by the French, like Senegal, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, which was then Upper Volta, like Togo and Benin and Suriname. During the parade in the morning, pupils used to recite our ancestors, the Gauls. A black pupil saying that their ancestors were the Gauls. They wanted you to speak French. And once they had picked a few of you and took them to the Sorbonne, you had to be a total Frenchman or a total Frenchwoman.
Indeed, Africa has been contributing to French wealth primarily through a neo-colonial system involving monetary cooperation, resource extraction, and economic ties, most notably via the CFA franc. In this, African nations under this agreement have been required to deposit a significant portion of their foreign exchange reserves into the French Treasury's operational accounts, a system that has been criticized for benefiting France by providing it with access to these funds, though the specific use is contested. This framework, along with historical patterns of political and military intervention known as Francafrique, has allowed France to maintain significant economic influence and access to African resources and markets, contributing indirectly to France's wealth while raising concerns about economic exploitation. Revolutionary movements in African nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, which are resisting French influence and demanding greater self-determination, or to internal revolutionary currents within France, such as those emerging from France's youth and autonomous movements in recent years, advocating for fundamental changes to the system, have recently come out to say no to these instances. With no doubt, France's economic stability is being affected by the loss of these former economic lifelines, leading to increasing debt and a perceived decline in power. Now the nation is struggling. Major trade unions called the strikes to demand the government abandon proposed budget cuts, social welfare freezes, and other measures they say will squeeze low and middle-income workers. Unions argue the austerity plan will deepen economic pain that has already toppled previous governments attempting similar reforms. According to one of French news agency, the agency suggests that the protests mark a critical test for new Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu, who was appointed last week and tasked with shepherding the cuts through Parliament to reduce France's mounting deficit and debt. After pressure from the protests, President Emmanuel Macron's decision to appoint a fresh Prime Minister. Lecornu's predecessor, François Bayrou, was ousted by Parliament last week over his plan to slash 52 billion from the budget in 2026. The agency adds,
resources and labor power because they wanted to retain total control of all the former colonies. The French colonial governments destroyed everything they were unable to loot back to their country after independence. The French colonialists banned food, killed cows, and destroyed buildings and books. The former colonies of the French regime, such as Gabon, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, Congo-Brazzaville, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, and Guinea-Bissau continue to use the franc currency, and their monetary policy are dictated by the French Central Bank. France continues to maintain strong and intimidating military bases in almost all African countries they had colonial control over. African countries that were under French colonial rule are forced to pay colonial taxes and currently paying more than 500 billion US dollars to the French treasury every year. And that is separate from the many natural resources French companies continue to loot from the African continent. The colonial pact that France forced all its former colonies to enter into include the following: paying for the infrastructure France built during colonization, keeping 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. 14 African countries have been doing this for years. Interestingly, these countries can only access 15% of their reserves each year. If they need more, they have to borrow it from France. France has the first right to purchase any natural resources discovered. French companies have the first right to choose on all government procurement tenders. Senior military officers are trained in France. France has the right to deploy its military in the African countries. Countries have to make French the official language and the education language, using the French colonial currency. Former colonies have to send a reserve report to France. Ex-colonies cannot enter into military alliances with other countries without approval from France. Ex-colonies are required to join forces with France during war or global crisis. The French government and regime have played a direct role in the coup d'etat and illegal and unlawful overthrow of many governments in the African continents. France is also responsible for the assassination of many prominent leaders in the African continent. Additionally, France continues to support and anchor nonsensical governments that have no respect for African people. This includes the following: Burkina Faso, which led to the assassination of Thomas Sankara; Guinea, Central African Republic, Chad. Mali's instability has always been sponsored by France. Ivory Coast illegal arrest of leaders and instability sponsored by France. The continued rulership of Paul Biya in Cameroon is financed and maintained by France. The permanent and perpetual destabilization of the Democratic Republic of Congo is aided by the French government. We commend and appreciate the work of revolutionary anti-colonial forces that are beginning to undermine French colonialism, particularly in Mali and call on all neo-colonized people under the so-called Francophone to reject France's colonial rulership and control. We commend the many anti-colonial and pan-Africanist forces in all the African countries and reiterate our call for the unity of the African continent. Despite the micromanagement of the former colonies, the French government continuously uses its resources to corruptly influence the internal processes of electoral outcomes of Africa's continental organizations such as the African Union and the Pan-African Parliament. France continued to identify puppets in different African countries and field them as candidates for important and strategic positions in different continental multilateral organizations. The economic freedom fighters, therefore, stands here in front of the embassy of the slave traders, the colonialists, the warmongers, and the imperialists to make the following demands. France must grant full independence to all African countries and allow them to determine their own currencies, monetary policies, and economic direction. France must stop all colonial taxes because it is the wealth of the African continent, the blood and sweat of Africans that build all infrastructure which African countries are forced to pay for many decades after the so-called independence. France must immediately remove all its military bases which is currently stationed in Africa. These include, but is not limited to, military bases, French soldiers, French aid through arms, and any presence of French influence in the armies or militia groups in Africa. France must desist from interfering in the economic affairs of African countries through monetary policy, and the use of their currency in West Africa must gradually decrease towards establishing currency system determined by Africans themselves. France must return all mineral and fiscal reserves held by the French treasury to African nations and any of their former colonies. France must pay reparations to all of its former colonies, particularly the architects of the greatest slave rebellion known to humanity, Haiti. Haiti has had its development reduced by racist global world order which feared African independence and the first black-led state. The removal of French as an official language in Africa in favor of continental reconstruction of African identity, away from imposition of white civilization standards and norms as a measure of humanity. France must stop its sponsorship of divisions that occur in Africa's continental multilateral institutions, particularly the Pan-African Parliament and the African Union. These demands are made to the government of France and sent to all colonial and neo-colonial forces in the African continent, including the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the United States of America. All forms and manifestation of colonialism in the African continent must be dismantled. It is our obligation as a generation to work fearlessly to dismantle colonial and neo-colonial rule. The EFF will do everything in its power to destabilize all forms of colonialism in the African continent and will play an unapologetic and leading role in the dismantling of all remnants of colonialism and colonial rule in the African continent. We stand on the shoulders of great anti-colonialist Pan-Africanists such as Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure, Emperor Haile Selassie, Ben Bella, Thomas Sankara, and many others. The EFF expects a response to all these demands within 14 working days. If there is no believable and practical response within the 14 days, we will, as the leadership of the EFF, outline a clear and practical program on how we will undermine and counter the French continued colonialism of the African continent. I thank you. Amandla! Amanda! Comrades, we are here to hand over this memorandum to the embassy of France, which must be taken directly to the government of France. We now call the representatives of the embassy to come and sign the memorandum and acknowledge the receipt of the memorandum.
€4 billion, that's about 55 billion US dollars. His plan included freezing pensions, that's the money that people get after they retire. He also wanted to remove 2 public holidays, 2. That would mean 2 extra days of work for the people. But they wanted none of it.
Indeed, no one knows what the future holds for France. Maybe it rethink its approaches, most especially reworking properly with its former colonies.